we lose the awareness of how we are learning. We lose the awareness of like, if this, then this.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Jana Dybinski, Director of Marketing and Culture at Rebel.com in Ottawa, Ontario. Jana and I talk about a wide range of subjects. We talk about culture in business, story, learning, algorithms, technology, artificial intelligence, authenticity, leadership, and this key word that forms a thread through our conversation, which is vulnerability. But more than anything, we talk about travel, geographic travel, mental travel, the travel through and by and with story. We talk about traveling in Zanzibar, Tanzania, in the Sahara, Morocco, Istanbul, India, Ethiopia, Ireland, Britain, and Thailand. But we come back in the end to vulnerability and story, these really key pillars to this conversation and, frankly, to this podcast. It's a really fascinating conversation, and I hope that you let me know what you think of it. You can go to the website at any time, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, and there you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me and let me know what you think of this podcast, of this particular episode, or any other. You can also reach out on social media. That's Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Finally, if you like this podcast, please give it a rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use. Jana Dybinski, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. This is great. And we're at Rebel.com, where you're the marketing director and culture director as well.
Correct.
What does that, so I've never heard of that before, Director of Marketing and Culture. What does that mean?
It's a good question. There used to be a function of culture that was performed primarily by HR departments within organizations, and you'd have your marketers off doing brand and all that kind of thing. And what we learned is that as the world continues to get more transparent and as clients, customers are really interested in what's happening behind the doors of companies, that the lines between those things started to really blur, and our brand strategy kind of became an exterior view of how we wanted to live our interior office life.
Interesting.
So the culture function grew very organically and really importantly and integrally out of sort of how does our brand look and feel when you're inside of it, and how do you experience it outside of it? So
I've read a lot about culture in business and how, when a CEO starts something, often they are defining the culture. And that definition of culture is what makes a business successful or a failure in the years, decades down the line. That those decisions at the beginning, or when someone like you comes in and remakes the culture, or not remakes it, but kind of rejigs it or redefines it or fixes it or creates contours for it, that can often create all the success that you need, because people obviously identify with brands, they identify culture. They want to see that people are living what they talk about rather than just being a PR campaign.
100%. Yeah, I think some of this stuff used to exist also in places like CSR strategies and that kind of thing. And all of that's just being wiped clean. And now it doesn't matter what it says on your wall. It does matter if you're true to what it says on your wall. Right.
And if you walk the talk, as they say. Mm-hmm. This is some of the stuff that I read in your bio in preparation for this, that your work at Rebel.com is a lot to do with, building and rebuilding the culture that is here and making sure that is front and center of the business. But there's another thing that you say in your bio, and you say that we're not just shaped by stories, we're made of them. I really, really liked that. A lot of the stuff that we talk about in this podcast, whether it's current events or science or history, always refers to the question, what on earth is going on? But the thing that I have thematically in the back of my mind always is, what's the story? What's the story that's driving the way that we do things? What's the story that drove the way we did things 700 years ago? What's the link between those two things? What's the story we're going to be telling in 50 years or 100 or 700 years? And to say that we're not just shaped, because we know that we're shaped by stories, but I think that stories are embedded in our DNA. I think that stories are what it means to be human. And I was really, really taken aback. I was taken by that statement in your bio. And before we get to what was supposed to be the first question, let me just ask you, what does it mean to be not just shaped by stories, but made of them for you, Jana?
It's exactly as you said. I think it's the...
Yes, 10 points for me.
No, it's recognizing that we're the narrators, right? Like we're writing them as we go. And I love your question for this podcast. And I actually think the question you just asked about the story thing and the main question you asked go hand in hand entirely. So I have a 6-year-old daughter, and 6-year-olds make really curious roommates. So it's a fascinating, and for all parents, it's just fascinating to watch your children grow and develop. So her latest, skill that she's honing right now is the armpit fart. And so for the last week, she's been really committed to like figuring this out. Like, how does it work? How do you do it? And she's practicing and she's getting quite good. And this morning she said to me, Mom, when I hold my hand this way, it makes a low sound. Demonstration. When I hold my hand this way, then it makes a squeakier sound. And I was like, yeah, totally. And on my ride, I ride my bike to work. On my ride in this morning, I was thinking at some point in our lives, we lose the awareness of how we are learning. We lose the awareness of like, if this, then this. And then I got all into thinking like, it's just an algorithm, right? Like we learn through algorithms, we experience life through algorithms. And going back to your story question, that consciousness around writing and crafting a story as you go versus just seeing it behind you, I think is just an algorithm of having some awareness around the fact that when I do this, then this happens.
Yeah, and that is what story is. I mean, many scholars have said that a story is nothing but cause and effect. This happens, therefore this happens. That's how computer code is written. That's how human beings think in the world. That's what curiosity is. And I think what's important is, and this is almost becoming maybe Buddhist a little bit, is to be conscious of the story that's being told and aware that you are being swept away in a story and aware that you're both narrator and narrated to in your story in the world, but also that being conscious of it doesn't change the fact. It just allows you to be, I guess, transcendent of it for just a moment maybe. And that is peaceful, but it's also enabling because it allows me to maybe tell a new story, maybe recognize, well, this is where the story is going in a place that I don't want it to go. So I'm going to take a left turn here and do something different.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
So Jana, I've got the first question then, or the third question then. And it's deliberately broad for a deliberately broad response. What on earth is going on?
Algorithms.
Okay, can you define what an algorithm is? Because I don't think I even have a clear understanding of it.
I think that depends who you ask, but in a really broad context, I think algorithms is the cause and effect, the learning through if this, then that. We here at rebel.com are in the domain and hosting space, work with a lot of programmers. That's how their work world functions. And as we just described through kind of storytelling in our own worlds, I think it's how we function and how we will be able to adapt in the future is to bring higher awareness to those algorithms. It's how kids learn. It's how we are able to recognize our own growth and development personally, professionally. It's how culture shifts, if this, then that. And I think there's a lot of that going on in the world. I think that there's these really interesting, on one hand, obviously with AI, algorithms are kind of taking over our lives, and the debate continues of whether we're using technology as a tool or if we're the tool to technology now. But alongside that, we've got this real rising of people talking about meditation and consciousness and presence and, following purpose and all that stuff. And I think it's really interesting that those things are happening together.
It's been said, I think, about algorithms that once you have a computer or a program that can reprogram itself in order to become bigger, better, faster, whatever, and not only be able to reprogram itself, which many artificial narrow intelligences can do, especially with games and learning chess or learning to play Go. Once you have a program that can do that, but do it knowing that they are doing it, that there's a sort of a consciousness that I am programming myself in order to achieve my end. In other words, I can choose a different goal in order to program myself. That not only is the definition perhaps of artificial general intelligence, but the definition of what it means to be human. That I can change not only my story, but change where my story is going. So if I am not aware of my story, I'm probably going to end up where I was always destined to end up. But perhaps being human is the ability to choose destiny rather than just be fated to it. I don't know. What do you think about that? Does that fit with what you're talking about with algorithms?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we have algorithms throughout our day. When I wake up, I do this. When I'm present and conscious, I am this. When I, before bed, I do this. And we try to set ourselves up for success that way. And I think the more attention we pay to when I eat this, then I feel this, and those types of algorithms in our lives, then the more we're able to create that story and that narrative as you're describing and bring more intentionality to it and more control over it. I think it pinpoints, the absolute only thing that I see us being able to control in the world, in our lives, is how we're showing up in any moment. And there's an algorithm right there too, right?
Mm-hmm. How important is your personal story here at rebel.com or in your work as a parent? How important is your own biography from day to day, your own narrative?
What a fascinating question. I don't know how important it is to the people around me.
Right.
I mean, it's obviously selfishly feels important. At any time, we're always the sum of all of the experiences we've had, and we're always bringing to the table, and that's always with you. So perhaps it's an important part of how you see the world and how you address challenges. I know you and I can't wait to talk about how you and I have had a very similar and very abstract, weird experience while traveling.
Yep. Are you talking about Tanzania?
I am.
Yeah.
I am, because I want to hear everything about how you ended up spending time on Mafia Island, which is as badass as it sounds in a completely different way than it sounds. I'm sure.
Totally different. No, I mean, badass was more what we experienced during that trip as opposed to who we were in that trip. But we can get there for sure. I asked the story question though for two reasons. One of them is because I think a lot of people, myself included, live day to day hiding our story. That we may be the product of our story, the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, but we go through life not necessarily wanting that to be revealed, almost as an automaton, that I'm a robot that is the product of all my programming, but that's been abstracted away. So I don't know if you know the book Thank You for Being Late by Thomas Friedman.
I haven't read them.
So it's, I guess, a couple years old now. And one of the things he says about the world is that the technological revolution has abstracted away complexity. So when you look at your phone, your iPhone or an iPad, or you're ordering from Amazon.com, whatever you're doing, or at Rebel.com, all of the complexity of your actions and behavior is abstracted away to become either invisible or easy and frictionless. So when I order a domain and web hosting through Rebel.com, I barely see it. I barely see all that millions and millions of things that have to happen for me to click a button, let alone have the service delivered, have the package come, have it be presented in a nice way. All of that stuff is invisible. It's like climbing a tree and assuming that the tree is just a physical object that I can climb, not actually a very complex organism that I'm interacting with. And the reason I ask about story is because we seem to be living in a world where all of this complexity is abstracted, maybe to a fault. The complexity of who I am and what my story is. Am I losing something by submerging it and keeping it hidden away from the world? Or is that just how we have to behave? I mean, the internet wouldn't work if complexity wasn't abstracted away from it.
I love that idea. I love everything about this idea. I think that there's a lot of pain and struggle in the human experience right now because maybe it's exactly what you're saying, but because our own authentic selves don't always have the space to just be. because I think we strive so much to be something else or something different or chase a version of success that was never from our kind of gut. And that a lot of people, really successful people, sort of feel that missing bit around, maybe, as you described, not being able to have just shown up as, I mean, we use the word authenticity. I don't know if that's the right word. There's probably something better, but there's a lot of language around finding purpose and that type of thing in the world right now. And I think I see some connections between the seeking of that and what you're describing there, for sure.
Well, and it's challenging too, because a lot of our world takes place in this online realm, and social media convinces us that everyone is living an amazing, wonderful life. But as Chris Rock said, when you go on a date, you're never meeting the person, you're meeting their representative. You're meeting their PR person, right? And you're also giving forward your PR person. And if all you ever see is everyone putting their best foot forward, then it's hard not to feel shameful for when you're sitting on a couch eating a bag of chips watching Game of Thrones or something. And I think that it's hard to be authentic when the world is telling us that we're not authentic enough, in a way.
Mm-hmm. And when authenticity is supposed to look a certain way.
Yeah.
Or we decide that we want ours to be or look a certain way, which happens to look and be like so many others, which is backwards for sure. Yeah, I think it's and it's interesting the way that maps over to the worlds I work in, which is more in leadership and culture development and that kind of thing, where it's really hard to be authentic. It's really hard to be vulnerable. I think that's some of the greatest courage that people in our world are displaying right now, is the vulnerability to just be themselves, or to be imperfect, or to be not have the answer. Mm-hmm. And for sure at Rebel, we have worked very hard on our culture over the last 5 years, and have certainly done what I think many people would say transform a culture from something that didn't feel as vibrant and brave as it is today, to something that really does. And the type of courage that takes for everybody in an organization to show up and be a little more authentic and contribute in a way that really moves the needle forward and allows you to know each other and to kind of deliver on a mission is unique.
I think vulnerability is a really key word here. Do you think that vulnerability is critical for leadership and also for the culture that you're, a positive culture in a work environment? Is that a key component?
Absolutely.
And why is that? Why is vulnerability so important?
I think we all need everybody around us, whether they're in a leadership role or not, to be able to be vulnerable, to be able to be themselves, to be able to bring whatever their perspective is, their experience is, and share that and bring that forward. Because without all of that, we're actually missing the key component or the ingredient. Any business is going to be missing the key ingredient, which is the thing that connects to the humans that you're trying to sell to.
Yeah, right.
Right? So like it kind of has this marketing angle and this sales angle and just the success angle in terms of business in general. But that's what resonates with us. We need to always find ways to be human together. And it doesn't work if we try to strip out some of the most basic human attributes, vulnerability being a big one, of course, and then try to function in a world where, people aren't just working between specific hours anymore. Like everything is so blurred now. The expectation is different. Do employers care if you're on social media? Well, probably not many anymore, as long as you're getting your stuff done. Mm-hmm. And then maybe that means that if something comes in when you normally wouldn't be working, there's an equal expectation that that's done. So there's just all this blurring of lines. And I think for leaders to not see that and recognize that and see that we need to be able to be whole humans, regardless of what environment we're in.
When I think what comes to me when I think of vulnerability is the ability to fail publicly and not treat failure as an end point, but rather as a starting point. And I know maybe that's a bit too what would be the word, sophistic, or trying to philosophize too much. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that when I'm vulnerable with somebody or they're vulnerable with me, kind of like what we're doing right now, I want you to fail to get an idea so that I can complete the idea, and vice versa. Oh. I want to stumble in this conversation. I want to not know what to say so that you can help me figure it out. And that vulnerability makes us find a common ground, which builds something new, which makes this conversation a dialogue and not just two monologues coming at each other. And I feel that it's hard to do that. I don't want to come into this conversation and fail. I don't want you to think at any time that I don't know what I'm talking about. But that's the key to dialogue. That's the only thing that makes dialogue work. And I would hazard that's the only thing that can make a successful culture work, is if someone's willing to say, I don't get it. I don't know what to do. And then someone else comes and says, I'm not going to take ownership over that. Let's own it together, and I'll come and see if I can fit the pieces of this puzzle together. And then maybe together we can own a new solution. It's the Hegelian idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? And I don't know if that rings true with you, but it seems to me that vulnerability means failure, but failure means success through others.
100% agree. In the spirit of it, then, you don't want me to think that you don't know what you're talking about. I don't think that. What else don't you want me to know?
Oh, here we go. I just opened myself up.
Totally did.
Well, I often don't get, I always say to people before a conversation, feel free to ask me questions. And I have had questions asked to me before, but it's usually when the other person doesn't know what to say. So they say, well, explain what you mean by that question. Then I have to elaborate. But you seem to be asking me a question now. And so what do I not want you to know? Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I might be not doing my job if I just go on about myself and tell you my story. I want to tell you my reaction to your story. I want to tell you my reaction to reading and doing research, and also my reaction, of course, to the things that you're talking about here. But I don't know. I worry that I'm not doing my job correctly if I suddenly just talk about how, I don't know, what I know about or what my experiences are. So, and now I'm feeling vulnerable for sure, because I don't know what to tell you.
I think that was the point of the question.
Oh, good job. You
no,
you
good
were
job,
successful.
You.
So then, okay, well then I think we'll come back to that, because my second question of why I brought up story is your own personal narrative. And I travel is so important in your narrative, and that's one of the things that I certainly could relate to. And I hope it's not too broad of a question, but why is travel so important for you, for other people, for the dialogue that we're talking about here, for being vulnerable? What is it about travel?
Travel is really important, and I feel so fortunate to have been inspired by parents who also traveled, and sort of always just raised with this infinite possibility of the world, and the world never feeling like a small place to me. And then equally grateful to have been able to go see and experience some of that. And I think it's really important to me, and I think I'll answer that in the context of why I want my 6-year-old child to carry that same curiosity about the world, and why I hope to gift her that same exposure to it. And I just think travel gives us context that we would never have, no matter how many National Geographics you read or documentaries you look at. It gives you context for the world, for your role in it.
You know, one way to look at it is, I'm just thinking of it now, that when you travel, you can't help but be a part of someone else's story. When you read about it in National Geographic, it's your story, and you're allowing this in. Mm-hmm. But when you go somewhere else, you have no choice but to accept another story and to be a part of it.
And you're not the hero of it.
No, definitely not.
Such a big part of it too.
You're an extra.
You're an extra, and you're a struggling extra in many times. And I think, as it relates to that narrative and to building your own narrative, for me, to travel is to really step out of safety, step out of the confidence I might have in navigating my own world, being the extra in somebody else's. And that is, profound, and it's humbling, and it's inspiring. And when we come back home and little things might frustrate us, I think the perspective that you get to keep with you of having been that extra when you go back into your story where you are the hero and it's all about your journey. I just think that that type of exposure and life skill is unreplicable in any other way. What's your answer to that?
Well,
because I stalked you online and I know you've done a ton of travel.
Well, before I did have a question though. Do you think that this kind of travel where you put aside your own narrative of being the hero and become an extra for a while, or become a listener for a while as opposed to a talker, do you think that that is more and more important in the age that we live in today, as opposed to 50 years ago or 200 years ago, when we seemed to be less individualistic and less the heroes in our own story? You know, someone living in medieval Europe certainly felt, most of them anyways, unless you were a king, felt that you were not the hero in your own story. You were the servant to the hero. Today, we're enabled to all feel like we're our own heroes. So do you think that travel, as you talk about, especially the kind of travel that gets you out of your comfort zone, is more and more important in this crazy influx modern era?
Yes. Yeah. In many ways, we have so much more alternative ways to experience what travel offers. But what I see as being needed for us in a work and life context moving forward is that flexibility and adaptability is going to become one of the most important skills, right? The world's going to change, 100 times for you and I in the next decade, and 1,000 times for my 6-year-old.
Or in the next year,
exactly.
Month, sometimes.
Sure,
yeah.
Day, probably. And so I think that the type of adaptability, flexibility that you learn by throwing yourself voluntarily into some of these situations only serves in a less and less predictable future where we just need to find out how to kind of jump in that water and figure it out.
It's almost like a skill you can put on your resume in the digital future.
I think so.
Huh.
You found, I don't know, I do put it on my resume, I guess. You found it somehow.
I never.
It's on your resume.
Is it on my resume?
Well, I mean, it's on your online prep,
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's hard though, because there are definitely a lot of contexts, maybe the majority of contexts, where that doesn't belong on a resume, where that's your personal, private, fun time, and that's not a skill you're developing. But I know that if I'm interviewing someone for a job and they tell me they've traveled, that means something. Yeah. And I'm not trying to say that, because that can be dangerous too, because usually those, especially in North America, who have traveled often have some privilege, not all the time, but often have the ability to do it. Not everyone has the ability to travel. So Absolutely. I don't want to disadvantage someone because they didn't get the privilege. But I know that if you've been somewhere that you weren't comfortable, and I'm not talking about going to a resort in Mexico or something, but putting yourself out there and being at the whim of the world, that's a skill, and that's something that's hard to acquire, and that it makes you resilient in the modern context, in an office like rebel.com, in many, many different work environments. Maybe it's actually a disadvantage to some. If you just want someone to do data entry for 8 hours a day, I hope they haven't traveled because they don't know what it's like out there, and they'll just keep working, right? But anyway, so I keep avoiding it. What's your question to me? Sorry.
I had a few that you've tried to evade. The guy who doesn't mind being asked questions. One was why travel is travel an important piece of your narrative and story?
Yes.
And if so, why?
I would give a caveat to that though, which is interesting given everything we've talked about. I think that travel doesn't have to be physical. I think travel can also be mental. I think it can be emotional. I think that reading a book that transforms you is similar to going to a different country and walking through a market and having things come at you that you never expected before. If you're able to let go and enter into another world, it's not actually escape. It's not just escapist literature where you're taken somewhere else and can turn off this world for a little while, which can be so awful or miserable or crazy or busy. I think that sometimes a good piece of writing is not escape, but a transformation of who you are and how you see the world. And so I want to say that travel for me doesn't have to be geographical. But reading, I don't have to put myself into a book. when I go and walk through a market in Marrakesh in Morocco, I have to be there, or something bad will happen, or I'll trip, let alone get, something stolen from my pocket or something. Not to say that the markets in Marrakesh are dangerous, but you have to have your wits about you. That's what other places are about. And you have to and if you go simply to stay in an Airbnb and not step outside and enjoy your view, well, have you really traveled? I think you may have visited somewhere. Maybe there's another word for it that isn't travel. Maybe you've flown somewhere, breathed a different air for a while, taken a swim in different water, but have you actually traveled? Have you been transformed? Because I think that if you are truly vulnerable to a place, you cannot help but be transformed by it. And your story can't help but be shifted. So, yeah, I would say that's why I think traveling is important, to get out of your comfort zone and to be transformed and to be okay with that. And I guess the second question to that would be for myself or for you. If getting out of your comfort zone is so important, where does it lead? If I'm constantly being transformed and at the whim of the world, well, where's that going? Do I become something better by that, or am I just having a good time? And I don't know the utility of that necessarily. I just know that I feel bigger and more comprehensive by doing it. Earlier in this conversation, Jana said that travel gives us context for the world and our role in it. And speaking of this context, coming up, Jana has a really interesting, funny, and frankly, incisive story about Tanzania, her time in Zanzibar, when she came and realized that she was going to have a guard and a maid assigned to her. All that's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On.
I think that anytime, and you're right, you don't need to physically travel, but travel maybe is a likely candidate for a thing that is going to give you that feeling of absolute excitement mixed with absolute fear at the same time. And I think when we put ourselves in situations where that is the feeling that we have and then move ourselves through those situations, those are our biggest areas and opportunities for, growing ourselves, whether that means getting to know ourselves better and growing our confidence, increasing our just vision of what we think is possible. I don't know. I think creating as many opportunities for ourselves to feel that exciting discomfort and then to be in a place where there's no other option but to move forward through it is exactly as you described. That's the piece that does transform you into something else. Was being in Tanzania excitingly uncomfortable? Yeah. I was very, very privileged to spend a year on the island of Zanzibar as a very young, quite naive, I certainly saw there and in retrospect, white woman in a place like that, and to work locally and live locally and experience it was, there was a lot of that on a daily basis. I think I probably felt some of that. And, at the end of the day, feeling that day after day for an extended period of time makes you feel alive. Do you miss it? I haven't been back, and I've thought about going back a lot. How long has it been since you were there? I lived in Tanzania 12 years ago. Do I miss it? I miss life being in a way where I could feel that every single day through something like travel. And I seek that out in my own life now in different ways because that's not, it's not able to be doing that right now. But yeah, I don't know. I think do I miss it? It's a hard question. Do you miss Mafia Island? No, I don't miss it, but I miss what you I'm the same as you. Same as what you just said. I don't miss Mafia Island, but I do miss the sensation of living in flux. Living and not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. I might know where I'm staying, but I'm not sure how I'm going to get there. And I don't know if the person that points me in that direction will actually know where I'm going. Or actually know where that is. It's this real state of survival, right? Like day after day where we are. Life is, certainly here in Canada, life is comparatively just so easy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one thing that I always say to give context of what it means to live in Canada is that you can drive from one end to the other. You can drive from St. John's, Newfoundland to Victoria, BC, take 2 boats, and that's the only time you're going to be stopped on the road other than getting gas or maybe sleeping. But if you don't have to sleep and you have an electric car that, I don't know, can run off solar power, you never have to stop. And most people would say, well, of course you don't have to stop. What are you talking about? You just get on the road. Yeah, well, you've never been to a country where you are stopped by the police or the gendarme or just bandits who are pretending to be the police and the gendarme, asking for money to get through the barrier every 10 minutes sometimes. Tanzania was actually, in terms of the other countries I traveled to, quite light in terms of the military and police presence and to the level of corruption. There was still a lot of corruption. But the problem with corruption, and this goes back to the conversation about culture, is that it is embedded in the way that things work there. So someone that grows up in Tanzania and is my age or your age and is living their lives, they don't know of a world in which this thing that we call corruption doesn't exist. For them, corruption is just the way things are done. If you're a general, you get to ask people for money to cross over your territory. It's just that's how it works. What do you mean you have a country where generals aren't allowed to do that? Sounds like generals don't have it very well in Canada. That sounds like generals are disrespected in Canada. I remember having a conversation because the president of Tanzania came to open an airport or to open a renovation of an airport, I think, in Mafia Island. And he had a big chair, huge chair, way bigger than everyone else's. And I was talking to someone after from Mafia Island, and they said, so in Canada, the president or prime minister doesn't have a bigger chair? And I said, well, no, not usually. It's the same as everybody else. And actually, it would kind of look weird if they had a bigger chair. I mean, you're not a king. You don't get a throne. And they said, well, that sounds like your president or prime minister is disrespected. That sounds like they're not being given the respect that they're due. And what I'm trying to get at is that if in Canada, we have a hard time seeing it the other way until we're there. Same on the other side. For someone passing through, having to pay a bribe to soldiers to get across a road, that's not corruption. That's just, quote unquote, the way things are. Mm-hmm. And that was a big lesson to me. And what we take for granted in this country, you know, we say we take for granted how much food we have. Yeah, I mean, that's an obvious one. But just the amount of interference that you have to deal with living in a country like Tanzania or Zimbabwe or Guinea-Bissau is uncanny, and it's hard to explain to someone here.
Yeah, absolutely. Not to mention that the road you're trying to drive on might just stop.
Literally become a track in the jungle.
Turn into nothing. Yeah.
I had that. I had my fair share of those. Yeah. The worst road I was ever on was in Guinea, in West Africa. And there was a several hour stretch where honestly, if there was no car, you would not be able to see it as anything other than a deer track. It was impossible to imagine driving through it unless you're just driving through it. And for one section, we had kids that were showing us the way, like running along with the truck and just having a good time. And it was funny because in this area that we were in, the kids didn't know to ask for anything. They were just having fun. In most places that are accustomed to Western tourism, they've learned to ask for a treat or ask for a bribe, ask for a pen, a cadeau, a gift in West Africa in French. And in many places, they've just never had many people come through, so they don't know to do that. And so they were just having a good time with us. It was so liberating, but also so scary to be on a road that really wasn't a road. Yeah. I'm sure you had similar experiences.
I did have some like that, certainly. I got schooled in Zanzibar.
What do you mean?
I just got life schooled.
Like what happened?
One of the first lessons I learned, a big one that's really stuck with me actually in life. And again, I was quite young, and I was very fortunate to be there in a working capacity. I was there with an amazing organization called the Aga Khan Foundation that had a grant from the Canadian government to bring some young professionals over. And they had set me up with great little kind of apartment thing in Stone Town in Zanzibar. And when I arrived, that came with like a maid service who was going to do cleaning and wash laundry. And I was deeply uncomfortable.
Did you know that was the case?
No.
So when you arrived, okay.
Yeah, I knew that somebody was going to help me find accommodation, and that was kind of it. So got there and saw the accommodation, and it was livable and great. And I didn't know that this woman was going to kind of come with it. Well, two people came with it. A guard who lived inside it came with it, and then this cleaning woman came with it.
Wow. And
I was really uncomfortable with both of those. And my discomfort about having somebody cook and clean for me, there was race discomfort. There was just the developing world versus coming from a developed country context, all these things.
Probably a privacy thing too, just I want my own space. Yeah.
I was just I don't like anything about this. I don't need it. I can totally figure out how to wash my own clothes. And, I was, again, in a bit of a hero of my story moment there. And so the first, kind of my two first decisions were, I don't think I need this guard inside the house. And I don't think I need this support. And that was fine. Everybody respected that decision. And the next day I had my first day at my work there. And my new boss, who was this phenomenal local woman, took me aside and said, "How's everything going? I hear you're set up." Of course, everybody knows each other. It's a really small community. I know you're living here and this is the person who helped you. And she said, "I'm just concerned about you making the decision to not have, the maid's name was Zainab, not have Zainab." And she said, "I think that's incredibly selfish." And it was the first moment, and it took her saying to me, "That is somebody's job. You are a really, really incredible employer in the context of this place. Working for you is that's the best. She's got 4 kids at home, and you just fired her." And I didn't get that going into the situation. I just had no sort of understanding of it. And then the humility I felt in that moment, and the way I suddenly, just in that second, understood my place there 10 times better than I had before landing, was profound. And that, continued throughout my stay there, in terms of kind of learning who I am in the world, and what I was by default and what I was by choice, and just navigating so many situations like that. So
that's fascinating, to recontextualize what it means to be selfish. Because, of course, that was the exact opposite, I imagine, of what you felt you were doing.
Absolutely. I felt like I don't need someone to wash my clothes. I can do it yourselfer kind of thing. And also just culturally, to be called out on it from such a place of heart and good intention from her was, it was a moment that stuck with me for sure.
Well, it goes back to, corruption. Obviously, there were many people who took issue with me taking issue with what I call corruption. And I still think that a country or a society that does not have this kind of corruption in it is stronger, more resilient, can do more things, unleashes an incredible human potential when you don't have to worry about who's going to come knocking on your door. Business, for example, requires certainty, and corruption is constant uncertainty about who's going to ask you for what kind of permit are you going to need in this town, who are you going to need to impress or give money to or bribe, and that creates a terrible business climate. So if a country or a society wants the business that we have in Canada or North America, the West, you got to get rid of corruption. But on the other side of it, it's corruption, as we call it in many African countries, is not that. It's about respect for someone who's in a position of power, and respect for someone who's the hero of the story. And while I may chafe against that idea, that is the reality of many places. And to simply say, no, wrong, I'm gonna whitewash this and get rid of it. Well, you're getting rid of a social construct that keeps people together, that allows them to know who they are. And in your context with the maid and a guard, as you said, they all know each other. Everyone, they're part of a community, and there are expectations in that community. There are expectations for who you are going to be and what your role is. Your role is not just to sit at a desk for 8 hours a day and do work. Your role is to be part of a society, even for a temporary period. And that, I can totally relate. There were many, many moments. Sometimes I felt like in my travels across Africa that every day was a novel of moments of paradigm shifts and appreciating the other side of the coin, which I didn't even know was a coin until I arrived. When you went to Zanzibar for the first time, were you scared? Or had you done some traveling before? Or like, what was your state of mind?
I was excited. I had done a fair amount of traveling. I started traveling solo when I was about 18. So I'd done some. I had not been to Africa before, anywhere on the continent. So there were things that I knew I was going to have to navigate and figure out, but I wasn't too scared. And again, I was very fortunate to go as part of a kind of a program where ultimately there were people I could ask for help, and they were phenomenally supportive if I needed it.
And you grew up with travel as a big part of your life too.
Yeah, it was just sort of what, my parents had these amazing photo albums of photos from the 70s. And, my dad did a road trip from, he drove all over Europe, but he drove through Iran and has these like just crazy photo albums of driving through Iran in the 70s. And so for me, just like...
sorry to interrupt, but I read somewhere that the steering wheel melted.
Yeah, his steering wheel in his car melted because it was so hot.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think all of that gave me comfort in just knowing that I'd be okay.
Yeah.
Figure it out.
I remember I crossed over the Sahara Desert in West Africa and feeling like the steering wheel never melted, but it felt like it was an oven, that the heat coming from wind was like the heat coming out of an oven when you open it to get, baking or whatever out of it. That kind of wave of heat was the same feeling of opening a car window in the Sahara Desert. And it was just unbearable. And I think that, we're talking about, I think, being culturally out of your comfort zone, but there's also physically being out of your comfort zone too. I adapted. I was living in Africa for close to a year, and I adapted certainly to the heat over time. But I like the winter sometimes. I like having the brisk cold outdoors, right?
Yes. Yes. Your listeners can't see this, but I'm very much a ginger, so I'm with you on that. The tropical, equatorial heat also for me was certainly a challenge. What's your favorite place you've ever been?
That question probably depends on the day. So today I'm going to say Morocco. And I think it was Morocco because I've been there twice and probably about a month in total, but I was able to go to a lot of different parts of it. And it's an extremely diverse country, both in terms of the people, in terms of the landscape, the things that you can do there. You can go surfing one day, and then within a simple 6-hour drive, you're literally in the Atlas Mountains, which are like the Alps or the Rockies, true mountains. But the most extraordinary thing that I remember in Morocco was arriving the first time I went, arriving in the Atlas Mountains in a town called Imlil. And it was, it's in the mountains, and on all sides of these mountains are mosques with the minarets. And the call to prayer happened. It was probably 9 o'clock at night or something, so the sun had just gone down, so it was kind of twilight. And the echoes of the mosques, of the imams calling to prayer, were echoing off the mountain walls. And 7 or 8 or 9 mosques at the same time, all doing call to prayer, created this incredible magical moment of being in another world. And that's something about the Muslim world, which it's hard to understand. 5 times a day, most people don't even think about it. Most people continue about their business. It's not like everyone drops and starts to pray. But the calls to prayer dominate the air. They dominate the world, and you can't help but recognize it and be part of it. Again, you can't help but that story take over your story for just a little while. And it doesn't even matter what you think about religion. It's just an important part of traveling in those countries. And in Morocco, in this particular place in Imlil, it just was like a wave turning me over.
It's like a beautiful haunting sound, isn't it? When you get a bunch together like that.
And it was dark, right? It was twilight, so I couldn't quite see them, but I knew where it was coming from. And it was just like being a wave that was, my feet were no longer on the ground. I was being tumbled into a new reality and a new way of living. But it's funny because I come from Calgary, so the mountains are very much a part of the way I see the world. But it redefined what mountains are. So for that, among many other things, I would say Morocco today is my favorite. What about you?
I asked you an impossible question and wasn't prepared for it to come back. I was going to say...
There's no correct answer. Tomorrow it could be something different.
Well, I think your answer is perfect because it really calls on the mood you're in. I was going to say Istanbul, which is my favorite city of all time, and has a lot to do with what you just described too. Just that echoing sound is so phenomenal. But I will say it's always a really big toss-up between Varanasi in India and Lalibela in Ethiopia. Did you go to Lalibela?
I've been in either, no. I always wanted to go to Ethiopia. I've heard amazing things about it.
The kindness and the people there and the culture is just spectacular. And they have these phenomenal rock-hewn churches that are carved and built underground instead of above at a time when the presence of Christianity was sort of wanting to be hidden. So they dug down into the ground and carved out of the stone these phenomenal churches that from when you're looking across the landscape, you can't see them. And then when you get closer, there's this like giant pit with a church inside it. And they're all carved out of one piece of stone. And the most spectacular thing about Ethiopia, from a land and access perspective, is that there's so little tourism there still that there's nothing like, there's these Bibles in these churches that are thousands of years old, and they're just sitting there. Like you shouldn't, but you could touch them. They're not behind glass. Right. There's no entry fees. There's no like, get your ticket here and you go in and you're like being shown it like a museum of any kind. These are still in use. They're just these phenomenal places. One more quick thing on Ethiopia. I met this wonderful little boy, Sefiu, who was like 12 and was kind of my tour guide when I was in a particular area. And he was showing me around, and I had heard about there being this church in the cave. And I was like, let's go to the cave church. So he guides me, and I have no idea where we're going. And it's, again, one of these kind of just like...
Going with it.
Just going with it. I don't know what's going to happen here, or if we're going anywhere. Well, it's just going to follow this kid. There's some shared language here. And I had described the church, and he was like taking me to this cave church, and then he's kind of suggesting that we're here, and I'm looking around, and I'm like, I don't really know what I'm looking at. And I look down, and we are standing on what at first seemed like cobblestone. And I was like, oh, okay, there's something developed here. I guess this is where we're going to find this church, maybe if we just turn the bend or something. And when I started looking at the ground I was walking on, remembered what I'd read about this and realized that I was walking on human skulls.
Oh.
And, you can find this church and you can read about it, and it's incredible. It's like in the mountains, but there wasn't any barrier preventing me from doing that, to experience this place. So I think for that reason, and just the unfiltered way in which you can still experience places like that, Ethiopia is pretty...
That's really cool. That makes me want to go all the more. I was traveling on and off. I lived in Europe for about 4 years, and for about a 6-year period, I was living there, and also went to New Zealand, and the Africa trip, and all this stuff happened in this period. But the first place I went on this 6-year timeline was Ireland. I was there for 3 weeks, and one of the things that I learned on that trip was what you just said. I went to all kinds of ruins, old monasteries and old castles in Ireland, because that was what I liked as a kid. I loved castles and abbeys and stuff. And to think that you could go to a ruin that's 1,000 years old, built in stone, and just walk around and touch it. For a Canadian who'd never been anywhere, like I was in Thailand when I was like 14 or something and didn't appreciate it. This was my first chance. And I later lived in England and probably took it for granted after a while. But that first trip just showed me there's no one here. There's no guards. There's no glass preventing me from touching it. If I wanted to, I could probably push that wall and knock it over. 1,000 years old or 800 years old, and there goes the wall. And the feeling of vulnerability probably that comes with that, like we were talking about earlier, that I was part of a story, but that the story was fragile and that I could actually affect it. I didn't, but it was so open. It was so available to me, and there were so many of them. And I don't know, I mean, this was, I guess, 12 years ago, so I don't know how much Ireland has changed, but I'm sure there are all kinds of abbeys and monasteries you could go to without another soul around and just walk around and be a part of it. And that was a big lesson for me in traveling, but also a lesson in terms of the contact with history, because I'm a nerd for history, and it sometimes feels so far away that my access to it is through 7 different layers of scholarship and books and reading, when sometimes your access to it is right in your face, and there's a piece of graffiti written in a stone from hundreds of years ago, and the graffiti is from hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
And that contact with the person who wrote that is so immediate, and it is a lesson for anyone who's interested in the world and the world as it used to be. You can be in contact with it. You can almost be in communion with that person that scratched that letter in 400 years ago. Jana, if there was one thing, because we're approaching the end of our time, if there was one thing that we could talk about for another hour, if we had another hour to ask what on earth is going on, what would be the one thing you'd like to dig into?
Probably more on the vulnerability front. The how to be vulnerable, fear, failure, how to share that, how to share someone else sharing that.
So how do you do it? How do you be vulnerable? Because I think you've shown in this conversation that you're willing to be. So how do you, is it something that you do? Is it a choice? Is it just something you come with?
No, I think it's something that you have to learn. And there's a lot of words that we use when we're talking about, leadership or in a business world. We use words around vulnerability like accountability or curiosity or courage or those types of words, but I sort of forget the question and sort of don't know if I just don't know the answer.
Yeah, I guess when we're talking about vulnerability, but I just want to know how you personally try to deal with it, live by it, use it, access it, bring it to be true in your life.
I love that line of dialogue with myself as a internal conversation and with others as an external conversation that you and I started to go into of like, what don't you want me to know right now?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how do we just engage on I'm going to see you as you are, and it's totally cool and it's totally enough and it's great. And then let's, while doing that, kind of create some space for that to not be your reality and to feel something different about that same situation. And how can I create that for you? So if you say, I feel like I don't know if I'm doing my job, how can I, in the role I'm playing here, help you see that you're doing it spectacularly? Right? And like, I think just maybe that starts with courage. I think before vulnerability probably is courage to go there in the first place, to not ask someone how they are, but say, how are you right now? Just little things like that and I see this curiosity in you of like connecting with people in a different way, but just creating even microseconds of.
Well, in what you just said, there were like 17 different microseconds of, oh, I want to talk about that. Oh, I want to talk about that. So I could flip that last question back to me and say, what do I want to spend the next hour talking about? And there's so many things. For example, I used to work in the theater for about 10 years. That was my business. That was my world. And there was a teacher that I had who had like the 38 rules, and it was a joke because you could add rules, you could take them away. And, I think the first rule was break all the rules. But one of the other rules was care enough not to care. And I think that's another way of saying have the courage to fail, have the courage to be vulnerable, have the courage to not have courage, have the courage to do nothing maybe sometimes. And it's interesting because there's so much in a conversation that's not just about what we're talking about, but what we're sharing underneath. And I think that what's interesting about dialogue is that, and you just said this, that I can enter into your reality, you can enter into my reality, but maybe more importantly is we can create a shared imagined reality that didn't exist before we met. Going back to this idea of story, which is kind of full circle, it's the first thing we talked about. And it's a book I reference quite often on this podcast called Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. Now we have another hour.
Now we have another hour. Oh, I could spend an hour on him.
And he talks about how the human imagination is the true gift that we have, the ability to share in an idea and share in an intention, and that you and I can create a new imagined reality and live in that for a while. And it's both of ours. It's not like I'm going to create something and you can step in and out of it and be the hero for a little bit. We're both the purveyors and the creators of an imagined construct. And in fact, all 7 billion of us on this planet are sharing in an imagined construct as well as in a physical reality. And I think that, you know, going off of what you're saying, that's what's so exciting to me about doing these conversations, but especially doing one with you, is it feels like we're almost building a scaffold of a new reality. And to only do it for an hour is kind of cheating us of the opportunity
to build. It's a bit of a tease, Ben, really.
Yeah. Ditto to you, Jana. So anyways, I've talked enough. Final thoughts.
Oh, Yuval is so astonishing in his thinking. Have you heard his interview with Russell Brand?
No.
Oh, it's great.
Is it?
Yes.
Have you read?
He was on Russell Brand's show. It's great.
Okay. And then you did the book Homo Deus as well, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Have you read those couple?
I have not read all of 21 Lessons, but Sapiens and Homo Deus, yeah.
So what is it about his thinking? Last thought. What is it about his thinking that makes you so keen?
I think he is somebody who's looking at that human experience and how, back to the story thing, we just keep tying a bow around this one, how we are as individuals and as a collective, for the first time in human history, we are the ones in control of our own evolution. So the thinking he's done around how we're participating actively in our own evolution right now versus it being a passive thing that's happening, and the pace at which we're participating actively in our own human evolution. I mean, he goes into all kinds of really interesting places, but I think of all of his areas, that the thinking that he's done around that, and thinking for ourselves around what role do we want to play in that? Who do we want to be in that? How passive or active and proactive do we want to be in that? I think is fascinating from a leadership context, fascinating from a culture context, and fascinating just from a human being in the world.
Do you know what you've done, Jana, in this whole conversation? You've done my job. Because you've done everything that I want to do. In the perfect conversation is one where the end is the bookend to the beginning. And you just did it. What you just said about what Yuval Noah Harari says, that we are now conscious of the story. Well, that's what we were talking about, I guess, almost an hour ago. We were talking about being conscious of the story that we're narrating and the ability to change the story as a result. That's kind of one of the key tenets of his books. So you just brought us back to the beginning. You should have interviewed me.
You can start another hour?
Yeah, I think we should. Jana, this has been really, really an excellent conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
For me too. Thank you for making the time.
Of course.
Appreciate it, yeah.
And thanks for having us here at rebel.com.
You are always welcome.
To learn more about Jana Dybinski, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me by email or on social media. Now, your quote of the week is from Brené Brown. Vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. Thanks, as always, to our composer, Andrea Wetstein, and special thanks for this episode to Rebel.com in Ottawa, Ontario, for giving us the place in which to record. Next week, we're talking with Calgary actor Andy Curtis. I'll see you then.